Good morning all, and welcome here to Ofcom to an event that both we are doing together with the UK Space Agency to try and, one of our objectives really is space is a growth area. It's an area where for the last 30, 40 years it's been dominated by geostationary satellites and the growth of TV and telecoms. It's an area expanding now into more and more people doing things like Earth observation, and we've got networks of satellites that are going up and we're trying to figure out how they've done. There's been a few false starts with networks, but hopefully they'll start again. And the increase in smaller scale satellites where people can put something into space now, it can do something and it can come back down again. The regulatory regime for satellites was really defined for the massive big geos in positions where we go and fight with other countries, a particular orbit slot in the geostationary range. We've got lots and lots of work now going on trying to figure out how we introduce the new types of satellite into that regime. Working internationally with all the people, as you can imagine, we have some people who are quite friendly to us and some people who want to use this as a commercial advantage. That happens at the country level. Never mind the competition that exists between the satellite operators who play off one regulatory against the other to do it. What we're trying to do through this session was trying to introduce you to what the regulatory regime is there to do. What we can do to both help you achieve what we're trying to do and then to try and defend the position of we've got to try and make that work, how we can make sure you understand the regulatory rules you have to play by and why we have regulatory rules, but also understand some of the work we are continuing to do to see how we can change the regulatory rules to make it better for people to do things from the UK, but for all satellite operators across the world to work better together. Ofcom, you may not see in this role normally. Ofcom, most of our headlines are all about what the price of telephone calls are, what we're doing to open reach, what we're doing to other things in the telecoms market to deploy broadband. In addition to all that stuff, here at Ofcom we're responsible for the management of the UK spectrum. And that's not just making sure that spectrum is available for the mobile industry, but actually making sure that absolutely everybody who needs spectrum can access it on fair and reasonable terms. That means sometimes we make very hard decisions because we move people from A to B to enable other services to work. And that's some of the work that my team continuously does and engages with industry. On the satellite team, we have a number of different things. One is, how do we support the satellite sector? How do we make sure the rules are right? How do we understand the technical coexistence between one set of satellites and others? How do we, once we've made a regulatory filing, which then becomes a UK filing, and here we do regulatory filings for the UK itself, but also for the Channel Isles, the Isle of Man, Gibraltar, Bermuda, all the places in the world that are actually British territories, but because it's satellite filings and everything else are done by the UN, that we here in the UK represent their interest in doing that. So you'll see if you go to the Isle of Man, you come through and actually it turns a bit Ofcom and therefore we do it. So we what's called the UK administration for this. The team does that. Once we've figured out how those work and once we give the filings to make it work, we then have to protect it against other countries and other satellite operators try and do it. So there's a lot of technical work and a lot of process. So one of the things we're trying to introduce you today is why we do those, how it works, and how we can help you go from I've got an idea to how can we get it launched into service. The other challenges for us are, as new types of satellites emerge, there's new bits of spectrum needed for control. How do we make sure that we understand what people want to do and how they need to do it so that we can actually build into the plans making sure that will work? Now, everybody is the most important user of spectrum because they keep telling us. A lot of this means people have to share. And a lot of things you ask for, we might say, I'm terribly sorry you can't do that, but actually if you thought about doing it here, it might be easier. So there's a lot of things we need to understand and work together to do it. So the idea of today is to try and introduce you to that. As you see on here, the team will go through a number of presentations. We're also very content to do one-on-one meetings. And hopefully by the end of the day, you'll understand both what we do, what the UK Space Agency does, how we can work together, how we help each other to deliver and make sure that you can get your projects into space, assuming you can get the funding and all the other things to get with it, into space and delivering the value and things you want to do. That's our objective today. Hope you enjoy it. The team's really been enthused to try and put things together and try and extend from what we normally do into this sort of thing. So now I'll hand over to Justin, who heads our satellite team here, who's going to take you through what the structure of the day is how it will work, and start the introduction of what goes on. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Philip. Good morning, everyone. I'm Justin Moore, I head the Space and Science team here at Ofcom. And I am truly pleased to see so many new faces today. We really tried to reach a new audience. I think there's a few familiar faces as well, but I really am pleased to see the group we've got together here. I hope it's useful for you. Before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping points to go through. There is no fire drill plan for today, so if you hear the alarm, you need to leave the building. You walk to the end of the floor here, and the concierge will show you where to go. The toilets, you will need an escort to the toilet, or you'll need somebody to let you in. You go through the double doors, but they will lock behind you. But we'll make sure somebody's around to let you back in if you have to go. I'd recommend waiting till the coffee break, and then you can make sure you can get back in if you go there. We have a lunch planned at just about 1:15, and I think vegetarians are catered for there. And an important point for everyone here is that, as well as the people in the room, the event is being streamed. So we've got a few people who could make it today who are on the end of a video stream. In addition to that, all the slides and the videos from today will be made available afterwards on our website. So if you've missed something or one of your colleagues misses it, don't worry, it will be there. What else? Some of you have booked one-to-one meetings. If you've done that, those will be in the afternoon. We'll let you know exactly the timing of those, but they'll be in the meeting room adjacent to here. And also to note that if you want to speak to Richard Crowther, he is here till 2 p.m, so you need to catch him before then. Otherwise, if you want the Space Agency, Mike Willis is here for the rest of the day. Good. So let me kick off with what we are trying to do. So you will start off with an overview of regulation and why we regulate. I'll hand over then to Barrett, who will give us an overview of how we regulate spectrum. We'll have a coffee break. After the coffee, we have 2 spectrum sessions. One is on satellite filings, and the other is on Earth station licensing. Then we have a session from Richard on Outer Space Act licensing. We'll wrap up just before lunch. Good. And if we have questions, I suggest we try and take those at the end of each presentation. If there's a burning point of clarification, you can let us know. We can take that part way through if need be. Good. So, why are we here? Why do we regulate? Well, regulators love regulating. We love our jobs. We like a good debate about regulatory provision. But seriously, space, it's vast, isn't it? It's unencumbered. Why can't you just do whatever you want? Why do we worry about regulation? Well, there's 2 fundamental reasons. Is that if you do things in space, there's a possibility you could cause harm, physical harm to something else, or you could cause radio interference. And if there's any economists in the room, that's what we call externalities. You go about doing your thing happily, but you affect somebody else. And that's usually the situation where we need regulation to make sure everybody plays nicely together. So specifically, if your thing in space could damage other things in space, or possibly things on the Earth. From a radio perspective, the communication from your spacecraft might cause harmful interference to other spacecraft. And if that happens, then actually you might suffer the other way around. You might suffer physical damage or radio interference, which means you cannot communicate with your spacecraft, which would be a problem, which may mean that you get out of control and cause damage yourself. So for those reasons, all the countries in the world, because it's not a national problem, have got together and agreed to some international treaties. And we'll talk more about those, but those underpin everything we do and why we do it, because they are the framework for international use of space. One addendum to that is that there's also a national aspect for your Earth station, and that is a slightly more ordinary question of spectrum management on a national basis in the UK, so making sure your Earth station doesn't interfere with other users in the UK or suffer interference. So that's why we do it. Richard is going to give his perspective on this too.
Thanks, Justin. So we heard in the introduction that space use is growing, as are the number of objects in orbit. This is an interesting slide. It shows the number of objects on orbit with time. You can see some significant jumps in that population. That, in my view, is due to lack of regulation or poor implementation of regulation. This is an ASAT test. This is a collision between two satellites. So we are signatories and we've ratified a number of treaties, conventions and guidelines within the UN process. And therefore, as a consequence of that, we need to implement those requirements in national legislation, which is our national act. We also are guided by guidelines and principles, and some of those, for instance, recognise the unique aspects of space, whether it be low Earth orbit or the geostationary ring, where if you put a satellite in orbit, you need to bring it back within a certain time. So these are the major treaties. I'll talk about them more in my presentation, but these are international ones. This is the Magna Carta of space in '67. A slightly imperfect legal instrument, so they had to implement it, complement it with the Rescue Agreement, Liability Convention and Registration Convention. So this one is more to do with notification. This is to do with damage in space, and this is to do with property rights. And then we reflect all those within the Outer Space Act. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, and there's just a couple to mention from the radio spectrum side. On the international side, the key bit of regulation is the ITU radio regulations, and that is administered by the International Telecoms Union. It's an agency of the United Nations, and so the radio regulations form an intergovernmental treaty effectively, and that governs all international radio spectrum use as well as and there's other parts to deal with terrestrial use as well. And then in the UK, there's the key bit of legislation in terms of licensing earth stations is the UK Wireless Telegraphy Act. Ofcom also has other acts governing its operations, which includes the Communications Act. So those are the two bits from the national perspective. So, a bit on the space age.
Thanks, Justin. So for most of you, I guess we're the good guys in that we coordinate UK civil space policy and manage the contributions into ESA, but also our policy involvements in the European Union. And we also develop capability either in industry or within academia to make sure that there are enough people to actually fulfill the jobs and opportunities that arise in space. Some of you may also view us as the bad guys in that we're also, and unlike many space agencies, we also regulate space activities. Now increasingly that's causing us some issues, and so we're reflecting how we can best manage that. But as an agency, we do have the technical capability in order to understand what you're planning to do, and hopefully within our regulatory processes, work with you to actually find the best way forward for your missions.
So Philip's already given an introduction to Ofcom, so you know roughly what we do, and you probably heard of us in terms of our communications role for TV, for mobile, but for you the most important thing is spectrum use. Our mission is around making communications work for everyone, and the everyone is a very inclusive everyone because it includes people watching EastEnders, but also the universities trying to download Earth observation data from a satellite. It is everyone in the UK. That is who we are working for. So quite a lot of sectors, including spectrum use, including postal and fixed line telecoms. Another key point about Ofcom is we are not a government department. We are accountable to government. We are governed by legislation that Parliament has set. As I said, that includes the Communications Act. And as a regulator, we abide by regulatory principles, things like being transparent, being proportionate, being evidence-based, consulting with all the affected people in what we do. And that's what you should expect of us. That's the way we behave as an independent regulator. And our key duty that you need to worry about is our duty to ensure optimal use of spectrum, which always seems rather challenging to me to ensure something's optimally used. That It sounds like perfection, but that's what we strive for, perfection. And then on an international basis, we have a slightly wider role. Internationally, in bodies that deal with spectrum matters, we represent the UK and all the interests of the UK. So we have a slightly wider remit there. And that includes our activities in the International Telecoms Union, includes our activities in bodies like the CEPT and in the EU at the moment. So I think that's enough for Ofcom. No, one more about Ofcom. In terms of our strategy for what we do in space, we have articulated a strategy for our space work. We consulted on this over the last couple of years. We published our conclusions of that at the beginning of this year. And in that, we set out 3 priority focus areas for our work. The first one is around satellite broadband, making sure people can get better broadband through satellite. And that includes the last 1% of the UK. You may be aware the government's looking at a universal service obligation for broadband, and satellite clearly has a role to play in that. But also on aircraft and ships. So we see the aircraft market is a particularly growing one, and there are some regulatory changes we are looking at to try and free up the spectrum for that particular use. Other key area that may be of particular interest to people in this room is Earth observation. We recognise the massive, massive benefits and the many ways in which UK citizens benefit from Earth observation data, both maybe from their direct personal use in mapping, or from better public services, from new commercial services, from better policy making if we know what's happening with the climate. There are a very wide range of applications there. We keep seeing new ones come along. We want to enable growth of that because we see huge benefits. And the final theme for our strategy is recognising all the existing benefits. So we've 2 big areas of growth. There are an awful lot of other areas of space use which are already there. And as Philip mentioned at the beginning, spectrum use doesn't stay still. We have new people wanting to come along. We have a duty to ensure optimal use of spectrum. We do try and bring new people in, new users in, get them sharing with existing users. But in doing that, what we are saying is that we are very, very aware of the existing benefits from people's use, and we look at that very carefully in how we introduce a new use. So this is the slide which will give a picture of what we're going to talk about today. It is an incredibly simplified version of the overall process, but we tried to get it on one slide so make it a little bit digestible. So, first area, satellite filings. We will have a session on this later. Key thing to note, it's potentially a long process. It involves the ITU, it involves us. You come to talk to us first, we deal with the ITU. Key thing on this is that the whole process between your initial filing and the end point where you bring into use and notify your satellite can be up to 7 years, generally. And in the very, very best case, it could be 9 months. That's pretty challenging. We'll talk about that later. So that's probably the longest, potentially the longest lead time thing to remember. Earth station licensing, it's a bit easier. It's just one thing on the ground, hopefully, possibly. There's a licensing process. You can come to talk to us. It takes a matter of weeks to go through that, to get your license granted before you can operate your Earth station in the UK. And finally, there's the Outer Space Act licensing process. I won't say too much about that. I'll leave that for Richard later on. But that is something that happens possibly after you've got your filing, and again is essential before you're actually putting something into space. That is the overview of what we're going to explain to you, the detail behind each of those. So I'll just pause there if there's any questions on the overview. I suspect your questions may be dealt with in the more detailed sessions, but if there's any other principles in terms of who we are, what we do, why we do it, it's a good point to take it now. No. Fantastic. We can press on. I'll hand over to Barrett. He will talk to us, give us an overview of the issues involved in spectrum use of satellites.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and my name is Bharat Dudi. I work for Justin in Space Services team in Ofcom, and my talk is on international regulations and small satellite. There's quite a lot of interest in ITUR, and ITUR has been working on small satellites since 2012. So I'm just going to give a quick update on that. I'm also going to talk about the UK frequency allocations and also the work under WRC 2019, which is basically looking at the spectrum requirement for small satellite. And the conference in 2019 will take a decision on that. So I'm going to talk about the UK process and how you can engage in a coordination of a UK policy. So first, let's have a quick look at through the international regulations. First, international regulations under in the ITU is very important for the space services, purely because of the nature of the applications, where any solution for the satellite, because satellite covers not just the one country, but it goes over the number of countries. Any solution you require, you need that solution on a global basis. So the international regulations is very, very important for the space services. I won't go into detail, but radio regulation is basically international treaty and law, and the text and the material, regulatory material compiled and contained in the radio regulations, which is adopted by the WRCs and includes example, I haven't captured everything, but it's a radio communication, the service definitions, frequency allocation, status, condition on the use of the frequency band, because there are different conditions, and also procedures on the filing, notification, coordination, interference management, and also recording of frequency assignment. Radio regulations are updated every 3 to 4 years after the WRC, and the next WRC will take place in November 2019. Most of the national regulations are largely based on radio regulations, and I already mentioned the importance of radio regulation for the space services. And one thing I'm going to highlight, that the complying with the national and international regulation is very important in ensuring harmful interference to other services. And other thing to highlight, that using the right band, i.e. consistent with the radio regulations allocations. And I already mentioned that ITUR is already working on the small satellites since 2012. So let's quickly go through small satellites and spectrum use and requirements, because small satellite has there are differences between the traditional satellites and small satellites, and that's where the new requirement comes into, and ITUR has been working on that since 2012. Small satellites, certainly we see significant benefits, but it also brings challenges, and that's where the new requirement, I'll talk about that later on. We're expecting significant growth in, or we're already seeing significant growth in launch of small satellite, and looking at most forecast, this growth expected to continue. Some of the key applications are scientific, educational, commercial, and amateur and government, and I think the scientific and educational applications and uses, I think that's where the majority of users are. This is according to the information in ITUR. Looking at some of the characteristics of small satellites, and these are low-cost omni-beam. So some of things here that it's creating the new requirement. So things like if you look at the short lead time, because from development to the launch, it's a very, very short period. So that they're looking for the bands which with the minimum regulatory conditions, because in ITUR, looking at the allocations, the conditions, as I mentioned, there's different conditions. Some of the band you have to go through very detailed coordination, and that could take quite a long time. So one of the requirements from the small satellite is that they need a band with a minimum constraint. Currently, most of the small satellites are operating in amateur bands. In other words, outside the band which requires the coordination under the Article 9, which is the detailed coordinations. And there was one issue was highlighted in a previous study in ITUR, that for the small satellites, because their launches are secondary payloads and piggyback on the big satellite launches. So in terms of the coordinations or the notification and API, they don't have information on their orbital parameters, but that issue is now, I think, it's been, we found a way forward on that. Okay. The key requirement from the small satellite is requires a faster process. So if something takes a year or 2 years, it's an issue for them and a problem. Also, minimum national and international regulatory obligations and constraints. In the ITUR studies we done in Working Party 7B, we are now producing a report on spectrum requirement for small satellite, and we now, in terms of the spectrum requirement, they need a spectrum between sort of around 1 megahertz for uplink, and something in region of 600 kilohertz to 2.5 meg for downlink, and this is according to studies we done in ITUR. Most users prefer spectrum for TT&C below 1 gig, but the information we have in ITU report suggests that in the future they may move to a higher frequency, but at the moment the requirement is below 1 gig. Okay. So I will very briefly go through what we have done in a previous study cycle. So as I mentioned that ITUR have been engaged in small satellite since 2012, and during the study period 2012 to 15, one of the issues they studied was looking at the current procedures on the notifying satellite network to support deployment of small satellite under the resolution 757. And after the study, the conclusion was whether it's a small satellite or large satellite, they still have to go through the comply with the regulatory conditions. So no change to radio regulation. That was the key outcome. At the same time, it was noted that there are the users, there is a new users for the small satellite. Some of them don't have information on regulatory compliance. So what ITUR done is to develop a resolution 68 on improving the knowledge on applicability of regulatory procedures for the small satellite. So that's in Resolution 68, and I provided a link right at the end, so you can download that information. I2R also developed 2 reports. The first one is on the characteristics, definitions about these small satellites. That's a report 2312, and report 2348 on the current practice, where we looked at the current procedures and whether that's suitable for a small satellite. So these are 2 reports. Very briefly, just going through UK frequency allocations, and UK frequency allocation table, UK FAT, details all the allocations, including the uses, and also where there are other uses, for example, MOD and other public body where you need to coordinate. So UK FAT has got all those details. And there is a link to online version of UK frequency allocation table. You can go, and through that link, you can select the frequency range, and it will tell you about what is allocated, what the conditions are. So that's a link. And I won't go through these details, but these are the typical allocation for satellite applications. And I'll just highlight that the frequency band 401, 403, I know that it's used by small satellite operators. But there is a study going on in I2R under one of the WRC 19 agenda item. So they're basically looking at small satellite use for the TT&C and compatibility with the existing use. And it looks like that they may be, the outcome may be, there may be conditions, putting limits on the hard limits, which may create issues for small satellites. So that work is ongoing. Okay, and very quickly, going through WRC agenda item 19, there is a agenda item called is a 1.7, and this agenda item is going to deal with this requirement of small satellites. And just to highlight that at the last conference, UK supported this agenda item to address the requirement of the small satellite operators. Resolution 659, which basically sets the guiding principle for work under this agenda item. And under this agenda item, we'll look at the 2 frequency bands. The first one is 150.05 to 174 megahertz. Second one is 400 to 420 megahertz. So the I2R work is focusing on these 2 bands for new allocations. Looking at the studies and work in I2R so far, finding a spectrum in these 2 bands, within these 2 bands is quite challenging. There's quite a lot work is still going on. And at the last meeting of Working Party 7B, UK submitted a proposal concerning the frequency band 403 to 406 megahertz, which is used for radio sons in the UK and also around the world. And that work will continue. And the next meeting is in May, so we'll find out more about the outcome on that at the next meeting. When I mention about the spectrum requirements, there is a requirement for uplink and also downlink in connection of TT&C. But one thing is clear, the spectrum requirement for uplink is more important, and I think that is where there's a lot of issues, because the requirement is that they need a band which is not subject to Article 9.21, which is problematic for the small satellite operators. Okay, and finally, I'll just give you an update on how we're coordinating UK policy on this agenda item 1.7. in the UK, all WRC preparatory work, it's under the IFPG, which is a sub-group of a UK Spectrum Strategy group in the UK. And there are 4 groups of the IFPG, Working Group 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Working Group 2, which I chair, is coordinating a UK policy on science agenda items, also HAPS and other regulatory issue. And 1.7 is part of that. And we meet at least 2 or 3 times a year. So if you're interested in participating in the development of UK policy on these agenda items, IFPG work, you just let us know. Other things I was going to highlight that UK is actively involved in the CPT and I2R work to address the spectrum requirement for small satellites. In terms of European policy in the CPT, there is a project team A, which is a project team of Conference Preparatory Group, CPG, and project team A is dealing with European preparation on this agenda item 1.7, and then it goes to CPG for approval. And just to highlight the importance of that if we, in the CPT, there are 48, 49 administrations, so if you can agree the proposal or way forward within the CPT, then it goes to the conference as a European common proposal with the 48, 49 countries behind. So it's a very, very important in terms of taking the work forward. In I2R, Working Party 7B, it's under the Study Group 7, is a lead group for preparing CPM text. And CPM text basic is a conference preparatory text, and CPM text on the agenda item 1.7 will include the sharing studies and outcome, and also methods to satisfy the requirement of this agenda item. So you will have a method A, for example, to allocations in 403, 406 megahertz, for example, advantages, disadvantages. So it contains quite a useful information, and this goes to the CPM. So the countries, the member state attending the conference, they know what the study is saying and what the options they have. So Working Party 7B is preparing CPM text on that. For us, the WRC agenda item 1.7 is we see as a long-term solution, because the conference taking place is in 2019, and so we won't know the outcome until late 2019, and then the administration will look at the outcome, and then they may have to amend their national regulations to allow those frequencies to be used for the small satellites. So it's a long-term solution. And in the short term, we are in a situation, we are getting quite a lot of interest from the stakeholders. The requirement is already here. So what we are doing, that we're talking to wherever there is they looking for spectrum, which is also used by other bodies. So we're talking to MOD in these, for example, to see if we can meet the requirement of this in the short term. And finally, I would say that we view that we value your inputs into this UK policy development process. It's a very important, and the input from the stakeholders will enable us to take a well-informed policy decision on this issue. And finally, these are just the links to those reports and resolution I mentioned earlier on. So that concludes my short presentation. So
that's fine. We can get going. So we've got 3 more sessions now before lunch, so we better get going, otherwise we'll get hungry. And we're going to kick off this next session this morning with Callum, who's going to talk about satellite filing with a particular focus on the non-geostationary satellites. So over to Callum.
Thank you, Justin. So my name is Callum Gray. I am the acting manager of the International Frequency Coordination Team. Our team is mainly responsible for the satellite filings and their submission to the ITU. So first of all, I'll just quickly go over the role of the ITU, which we've briefly covered already. So they're the specialised agency of the United Nations who coordinate the telecommunication operations throughout the world. There's around 193 members, of which the UK is one. There's three main sectors within the ITU, one being standardisation, the development, and the ITU-R, which defines and manages international framework for telecommunications. So, just going to briefly go over what is a satellite filing. Most of you sitting around may have your projects already planned, but you might not be aware that you actually need to go through the process of making a satellite filing. So a satellite filing obtains international recognition for your frequency assignments. As Justin has previously mentioned, this is to mitigate any risk of interference for all spacecraft which is in orbit. It also contains technical characteristics that the satellite can operate under, some of these being the frequency assignments, the missions, class of service, orbital planes for non-GSO satellites, or orbital location if you're operating a GSO satellite. So what is the role of Ofcom in all of this? Ofcom is the filing administration of the United Kingdom. As we briefly mentioned earlier, we also represent some of the overseas territories and the Channel Islands as well. We regulate the use of spectrum. Currently, we represent 25 operators through the UK and around 300 plus satellite filings. So as you can imagine, dealing with all of these satellite filings and submitting them to the ITU is quite a resource-intense work. Just to give a bit of representation, this is the amount of active UK filings that we have had over previous years. And as you can see, there has been a significant increase in the amount of filings that we receive of recent time. So, in a way, what we're trying to do is to ensure that the orbital spectrum resource, which is a scarce resource, is used efficiently and as effectively as possible. And one way we do this is we have the procedures for the management of satellite filings. Within this, we have certain criteria and milestones of which UK satellite operators must adhere to when making a satellite filing through the UK. Some of them being, of course, being registered as a UK company, not specifically within mainland UK, so you can be registered in Gibraltar, Bermuda, the Isle of Man. A clear project plan, so covering the types of services that you're looking to provide, which frequencies you're going to be using, and a clear layout of the milestone process from start to launch of your project. We also require that some coordination analysis is carried out before you do come to us with a satellite filing, just to ensure that you have preempted the amount of work that is required when you do go through the process. Just a note on the project plan, of course we know that projects can change as they progress, so we can be flexible in that approach if your project plan was to change, then you just need to inform us when it does so. We touched upon the UK frequency allocation table earlier in Barrett's presentation. For any frequencies which are identified under UK 2.1 within the frequency allocation table, Ofcom has to liaise with the MOD initially to receive their comments. Now, part of the ITU role is also to supply the appropriate tools in order to make satellite filings. So I'll just run through some of the software that they make available in which UK operators can use when making filings. So the first being space capture. This is really where you build your satellite filing. This is where you input all your technical characteristics, and at the end of it, it will output a database file which you can submit through to us at Ofcom. The second being GIMS. This software is used for creating antenna diagrams for your coverage and service areas. This is more applicable to GSO satellites. Space validation. Once you've created your database in space capture, the output file you can run through space validation software, and it will give you a report on any warnings of inputs that you've missed or you may have incorrectly inputted, and give you also some kind of guidance on how you can rectify that. And finally, Space Publisher. With this software, you can input any of the existing satellite networks that there may be and produce a report which will give you detailed information on that particular satellite network. The ITU also make available some e-learning tools. I've highlighted this as a link so that anyone after the presentation can click on. And it will kind of give you a step-by-step walkthrough on how to make a satellite filing and what you need to do. Just to make you aware, once you have created your satellite filing, to submit that through to us at Ofcom, you can send it to the IFC inquiries email address. But please do ensure that when you submit the database file that you place it in a zip file, because otherwise our firewall throws it out and we won't receive it. So I'm going to go over briefly the timescales of satellite filings. Understandably, with small sats, the timeframes are quite short with the off-the-shelf kind of hardware that you can purchase these days. First of all, I'm going to cover the timescales for those which contain frequency assignments that are not subject to coordination, which, if you would like the reference, is subsection 1A of the radio regulations. So Justin touched upon briefly earlier, if this is a new process to you, it may be wise to come and see us 2 months prior to your submission. We can discuss your business plans, your business case, and give any guidance on how to progress further. So once you've prepared your satellite filing, you can submit it through to us at the email address. Our procedures states that we aim to submit this to the ITU within 10 working days. Once the ITU receives these submissions, then they could take up to 3 months to process. So once we've submitted it, the ITU's job is to ensure that it complies with the radio regulations, and they also carry out their own analysis. If everything's okay with the filing, then it is published as a special section, and this is made available on the BR IFIC. This is a bi-weekly circular disc which is published by the ITU, which can be purchased from the ITU for 600 Swiss francs per edition, or 3,500 for the full subscription. So within this circular, it will have all of the new satellite filings that the ITU has received and carried out their analysis of. So not only will you be able to see the information of your satellite network, but all those across the globe, who else is filing, what they're filing. Once it's published, everyone else across the globe has a 4-month period to supply comments. So these particular comments could be in relation to exclusion of their territory, potential interference to space services, or anything else. Now, I did mention that these are frequencies not subject to coordination, so you could be asking why are other people commenting on this? This is really just to make you aware of these potential issues. Now, although it does say not subject to coordination, within our internal procedures, we do kind of press on UK operators to ensure that they do liaise with those who have supplied comments to mitigate any risk of interference going forward. From then on, there's a period of a minimum of 6-month period before the satellite filing can be notified and brought into use with the ITU. So as you can see, if you're planning to launch next year your satellite, you really need to be submitting the filing information to us in order to carry out the full length process. Next, I'm just going to cover those which are subject to coordination, as the timescales vary a little bit more. So you make your submission to Ofcom. Ofcom will aim to submit within 10 working days. The ITU carry out their own analysis. Whilst they're carrying out their analysis, they will publish a API, which is Advanced Publication Information. That will also be published on the BRIFIC disk for everyone to see. That will just hold limited information of the satellite network. And then a 4-month period has passed, and the ITU will publish a coordination request on the BRIFIC disk. Now, for this process, once the coordination request is published, it will identify those with which you need to coordinate with. It also gives a period of time for different administrations to supply comments. If they weren't initially identified, they could include themselves as requiring coordination. Once comments have been received, the ITU will then review and then publish another special section which will hold the final list of the coordination requirements. Just to mention something I previously missed, when the other administrations do comment to us, they do so in writing. So we receive an abundance of letters when we do publish a network. These letters are then passed on to the concerned UK operator so that you're always aware of the details. And from then on, what we do expect is that the coordination discussions do occur between the UK satellite operator and all of the foreign operators. What we want to try and do is achieve as much coordination agreements as possible to mitigate any risk of interference. So when you do look to notify your satellite network, we will reassess the coordination requirements which were published and look over who you have actually coordinated with. When submitting the notification, the ITU states that all efforts must have been carried out in achieving coordination. Unfortunately, it's always hard to try and achieve coordination with everyone, so we appreciate that it's never going to fully occur. So if that was to be the case, you may notify your network and it will be recorded in the Master International Frequency Register. For those administrations with which you have completed coordination, for those with which you have not completed coordination, it will be recorded on a non-interference, non-protection basis. So the real goal is to go out there and try and coordinate with as many people as possible. And of course, the full timeline of the submission to the ITU and when that filing would actually, the regulatory expiry of that filing is a maximum of 7 years. So the costs of the filing. For non-GSO satellites, which are not subject to coordination, is 570 Swiss francs. The ITU will issue this as a cost recovery fee for the work they have carried out. They will issue the invoice to Ofcom, and it is the responsibility of the UK operators to pay the cost recovery fee of the ITU. This is all captured in our procedures document. From then on, the notification of the NGSO not subject to coordination is around 7,000 Swiss francs. Again, this is the responsibility of the operator to make payment. If payment is not received, then the filing will be cancelled by the ITU. You also have 15 days from the date Ofcom submits the filing to the ITU to retract your filing. If you do so within those 15 days, then it will not incur any cost recovery fee. For fees charged by Ofcom, currently there are no fees charged by Ofcom in the process of making a satellite filing. Earlier this year, a digital economy bill went through Parliament and received royal assent on the 27th of April this year. This gives the power to Ofcom, allowing us to charge, to capture and cover any cost incurred in the management of satellite filings. So currently we are working on methodology of how this will be carried out and hopefully publish a consultation at the end of this year, possibly. For those which are subject to coordination, it's a little bit more complex, as you can see from this diagram, which I apologise if you can't read clearly. But in essence, it's calculated by the frequency assignments, the emissions, and the class of services that you have within your filings. Just to note, once you've created your filing with the space capture software, there is some tools within that software that you can run which will calculate the costs for you. So at least you'll be aware before you do make the submission to Ofcom how much you're looking to be charged. So I've just put here some radio regulation references which might be of use to everyone. So the procedures, they're covered in Article 9 and 11 of the radio regulations. The submission format is covered in Appendix 4. Technical and operational limits covered in Article 5 and Articles 21 and 22 of the radio regulations. And the criteria and methodology to identify coordination requirements is covered in Appendix 5.
So my name is James Richardson, and in this section of the talk I'm going to provide an overview of how to license a satellite earth station. And I'll start off by giving a bit of background as to why Ofcom licenses radio equipment in the UK. I'll give you some examples of the types of radio equipment that we do license, and then we'll look at a bit more detail on satellite earth stations and the process for getting a license for an earth station. So first, just some background on licensing. So Ofcom's duties for managing the radio spectrum in the UK are covered under the Wireless Telegraphy Act 2006 and the Communications Act 2003. And these duties include a number of things, but what it really all boils down to is that Ofcom needs to ensure the optimal and efficient use of the radio spectrum. So the radio spectrum is a valuable resource. It's also a finite resource, so there's only so much of it to go around. And so it's Ofcom's duty to carefully plan the use of the spectrum to make sure that everybody uses it efficiently and ultimately doesn't interfere with one another. And it's because of this that the Wireless Telegraphy Act requires that radio equipment, use of radio equipment may only be used in the UK under a license or a specific exemption from licensing. So if you're using radio equipment, doesn't matter what it is, you need to make sure it's either got a license or you need to make sure that there's a bit of legislation somewhere that says that that type of radio equipment doesn't need a license, and otherwise license exempt. And note also that unlike some other countries, we don't license the space segment from a wireless telegraphy point of view. We do under Outer Space Act licensing, but under wireless telegraphy, we don't license the space segment. The satellites are up in space, they're beyond our jurisdiction. So we only license the ground segment, which is UK territory, which includes UK airspace and UK territorial seas. And also worth noting here that all receivers are exempt from licensing. So a receiver is incapable of interfering with anybody, and so it doesn't bother anybody, so there's no need to license it. If you have a transmit license, so it might be a satellite earth station transmit license, and the earth station is also receiving, then we can record the receive frequencies on the license and take into account those receive frequencies in our spectrum planning. If you have, for example, a satellite earth station which is operating in receive-only mode, so it's purely just receiving, what you can get is a thing called a Recognized Spectrum Access, RSA. And it does effectively the same thing. It just means that we will take into account those frequencies when we are planning the use of the spectrum for other users. And RSA there is a voluntary thing. So you don't have to have it, but it's there if you want it. Okay. So there's a quick slide here just to give you a flavour of the types of radio equipment that we do license. And these fall in a range of different types of sectors and types of services. So you've got aeronautical and maritime radio, which includes all types of radio equipment installed on aircraft and ships, and also the supporting ground infrastructure for that. You've got business radio, which is typically handheld radios used by taxi companies, construction sites, hospitals. You've got microwave links, which are terrestrial-based point-to-point microwave links, predominantly used by the mobile operators to provide backhaul for their mobile base stations. You've got program making and special events, PMSE, which is things like wireless cameras, wireless microphones, talkback, in-ear monitors, predominantly used by the entertainment industry for theatres, sporting events, concerts, that sort of thing. And then you've got satellite earth stations, which we've talked a lot about. So this is for things like Earth observation or satellite broadband or whatever it is. And there's many more, so there's just a flavour of the types of things that we license. So if we now focus in a bit more on satellite earth stations, licenses are available in a range of different frequency bands, different types of equipment, satellite earth station equipment. And I've split these here into sort of two sections, those that are licensed and those that are license exempt. So on the left-hand side, you've got things like VSATs, very small aperture terminals, which we license, SNGs, satellite news gathering, and then this sort of bin here called permanent earth stations, which are the more sort of traditional, generic sort of category of sort of fixed-sited earth stations. And then over on the right-hand side, license exempt. You've got satellite phones, you've got GPS receivers, and I've added in something there called HDFSS, which is a very specific exemption that we introduced within the last sort of 5 or 6 years. Essentially, it's sort of typically two-way broadband user terminals, and only in a very specific band, which is up at 28 gigahertz for that exemption. And as I said before, if you're operating any of this kit in receive-only mode, you don't need a license. It's license exempt. And then just an example here. So if the nature of your business is for CubeSat TT&C, which we've mentioned a lot today, then the license there is probably the most appropriate one for you, which is the non-fixed satellite earth station license. And there's a little screenshot there showing you what the front page of that might look like. So if we look now at the process for licensing an earth station, if you want a license, you have to apply for one. So the first thing you need to do is fill in an application form. And there's a link on the slide there which takes you to all the application forms for the various satellite earth station licenses. And again, just an example of what one of them might look like, at least the front cover. And that application form is predominantly for the sort of administrative details about the company name and address and the contact persons on the license. And more often than not, you would probably also need to fill in a separate spreadsheet, which looks vaguely like the thing on the right-hand side there. And this is to provide all the technical characteristics of the earth station that you wish to license. Things like location, frequency, power, antenna characteristics, etc. And that's so that we can coordinate that application with other users of the spectrum. And ultimately, if we were to issue the license, those technical characteristics get printed on the license and become a condition of the license. Okay, so I've done a timeline here as well. The main steps here, going from left to right. So talk to Ofcom, submit your license application, pay a license fee, and then we grant the license. But just going in a bit more detail. So that the bit on the left, talk to Ofcom, you notice I've greyed it out slightly. You don't have to do that, but it might help you if you're new to the business. You might want to come and talk to us. It might be that you don't know what type of license to apply for, or it might be that you're a bit unfamiliar with what frequency band might be appropriate, or it might be simply that you're having trouble filling in the application form. So come and talk to us if you need to, and allow a bit of time for that. And then the process sort of starts when you submit the application form to us. Now it takes a minimum of 6 weeks for Ofcom to then process that application. But you'll see there I've put 10 weeks, so my advice would be to allow up to 10 weeks for that process to take place. And that's because more often than not it's going to need external coordination with some other external bodies. It could be anything. It could be the UK Space Agency, it could be the Met Office, it could be the MOD. So allow a bit more time for that coordination process to take place. And then assuming that coordination process is successful, and we go ahead and issue the license, the first thing you need to do is, we send you an invoice, and then you have to pay the license fee, and then the license is granted. And I've just said allow a few days for that to happen, for all the financial transactions to take place and the communication back and forward. So overall, that looks like 4 plus 10 plus a little bit, so it's about 15 weeks. Okay. And then my last slide is just to talk about license fees. So I'm sure that's very important to most of you. So there's quite a useful link there on our website again, which tells you what the license fees are for each of the earth station license products. What's that picture? That's just a picture of an invoice that we might get in the post if you applied for a license. So the link there is very useful. So it sets out the fee for each license. Some of those fees are fixed cost-based fees, so they're designed to recover the cost to Ofcom of actually administering that license. And some of them are based on administered incentive pricing, where the fee reflects the opportunity cost of the spectrum and therefore incentivizes you to use it more efficiently. So there's two broad types of way that we set fees. And then using this example, this type of license called the non-fixed satellite earth station license I talked about previously, that is a fixed fee of £500 per year, that license. And notice that's renewable annually as well. So for every year that you have the license, you have to pay another £500. And then, yes, and don't assume that the fees will remain constant forever. So we do carry out fee reviews from time to time. I think the last time we carried out a fee review on satellite earth stations was about 10 years ago. No, maybe about 8 years ago, 2008, 2009. But don't worry too much, because as we talked about previously, like with everything else that most other things that Ofcom does, we will always consult publicly. So if we come up with any proposals for license fees, we will publish a consultation, and then you'll have a chance to input into that process.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Rich. So 2 very big caveats with this presentation. One is it's very much restricted to CubeSats, although increasingly we struggle to understand what we mean by CubeSats, because is a 12U a CubeSat? I'm not so sure anymore. And also it's in relation to the Outer Space Act. So you may be aware there's a space industry bill currently going through Parliament. And so this is the current position, our current reflections on policy, but that could possibly change once the Act passes through Parliament. So I mentioned before that we're driven very much by the Outer Space Act, the Outer Space Treaty as the basis for our considerations, and we reflect those obligations along with those from the Rescue Agreement, Liability Convention and the Restoration Convention. And we pull all those together, and you'll see that the clauses in these documents are also reflected in the Outer Space Act. But it's from this that we then derive, and this, for instance, the insurance requirement we place on operators. Now this was developed in the 60s, these in the 70s, this was in the 80s, and subsequently we've been able to reflect principles and guidelines developed by the UN within how we interpret our obligations in the Act. But we're going to draw these together in the Space Industry Bill, as I said, that's currently, I think, in the Lords. You should be familiar with this. This is the normal mission cycle, life cycle, from having the initial idea, so from concept to grave, or cradle to grave, and in the case of a geosatellite, graveyard orbit, so it's been disposed of in an appropriate orbit so it doesn't interfere with other satellites. And what we try and do is match our licensing process with what you're doing. So we don't try and place any further obligations or burden of effort on you other than you'd otherwise do. So for instance, in the different phases, different aspects of our assessment, we will try and use what you're doing anyway. So for instance, if you have PDR, we will try and reflect those documents you produce for that in our assessments. And increasingly, in fact, people are asking us to attend CDRs because it helps them and helps us to understand if there are any pitfalls, issues that we should be aware of. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to talk to us at this stage, because if you come to us at this stage and you haven't negotiated your launch service agreements, you haven't started to cut metal, then if there's an issue that we have with your mission, which means that we can't license it in its current form, you need to go back, and it's going to cost you money to modify the mission to get a license. So talk to us early on, and we see this as a process, certainly for new entrants, to educate them in all the obligations and requirements that we will place on them if they need a license from the UK. But the process is to go through, so you come and talk to us. Currently, has anybody here been traffic light? So there's a new system, we're trialling a system called traffic lighting. So at this pre-application consultation phase, we will ask you 10 questions. On the basis of the answers to those 10 questions, we will give you an indication of whether we can license your mission or not. So obviously no one's applied for a license recently, or at least asked us about a license. But what we will then do is feed back and give our view as to what you need to do. And then as you go through, if we're comfortable and we think we can license it, then we'll ask you to submit your data. Now, if you go on our website, so if you Google Outer Space Act, there's a whole lot of information on there about the process and our requirements as far as data needs that you need to provide us with. We will then analyse the data in-house, or we'll provide it to one of our technical assessors, and if we're happy, we'll have an interagency discussion with FCO, MOD, about other aspects of the application, and if we're happy, then you get your licence in time for your launch. And then increasingly we're asking you to report on the mission when it's up there. So are there any issues? So exception reporting, then you need to tell us, but also we ask for annual health checks. And again, if you're an established operator, you would do this and provide this information to your underwriters. And so we're just asking you to provide that and share that same information to us. Okay, so these are the questions we ask within the out-of-space packs. They all boil down to these 6 questions. So we need to know who it is that's going to perform an activity in space, why it is they want to do it, when are they going, how are they going to get there, what is it they're going to do, and how are they going to, what systems are they going to use when they're up there, and which orbits are they going to. So it just boils down to that, but there are hundreds of questions that we ask you depending on the nature of your mission. And for me, as a technical assessor, these are the important things. So we're trying to look at operational risk. So we're asking you how you're going to get into orbit, what it is you're going to take into orbit and what you're going to do when you're there, and where is it you're going to be. And obviously the when is, we also reflect parts of the when as to your orbital lifetime and mission lifetime. And so that translates, as I said, to the launcher. And so in the traffic light system that we're trialling, we're looking at the different aspects of the mission in terms of the launch system, or injection system, the platform you're going to use and the payload on that platform, and how it's going to be operated. And then also the orbit you're going into, and then what you do at the end of the mission lifetime. So those are the 3 aspects that we currently consider in our piloting. We're also trying to reduce the burden on operators. So in the past, every time you ask for a license, we would give you a list of questions, and you'd have to answer those questions each time, regardless of whether there's any change in the mission. So now we're streamlining our processes, and this hopefully will be reflected in the space industry bill as well, that there are different levels of assessment and therefore different levels of data we require from you. That means a reduced assessment for us means it doesn't cost us so much, we don't have to pass on those costs to you, and it doesn't take so long as well to perform the assessment. So the different levels, a primary assessment is pretty much a baseline, so it's everything. We will climb all over your documentation and understand how it is you're going to operate. A secondary launch assessment, license assessment, will be just a delta. So, for instance, if this was we'd originally done a baseline assessment for launch into LEO, and then all you were doing is change, it was the same launch vehicle, same platform, but you're going to a slightly different orbit, then we might do a secondary launch assessment, so we wouldn't ask for so much information. In the case of an exact repeat, we call that a tertiary assessment. So in other words, we wouldn't ask for so much because you're actually doing the same as you've done previously. This is relevant to CubeSats, it's also relevant to the constellations that are envisaged for the coming years. So this then translates into different levels of ask from us to you. So as I said, if you go onto the website, there are lists and lists of questions. If your mission is not standard in that it's not something that's just a normal GEO comms or a LEO Earth orbiting remote sensing system, we may actually give you another set of tailored questions for your particular mission. So we're seeing that increasingly for some of the more exotic disruptive missions that are coming along. So in this case, these are the questions on the website that you need to provide us answers to. This is your baseline assessment, where we pretty much ask you all the questions. But for your secondary assessment, only a few things have changed. So your mission profile may have changed, and so the trajectory may be different from your launch site, and therefore we would ask you for that. But we wouldn't ask you this again. So once that's in the system, we can reuse it. So that, as I said, reduces the burden on us, reduces the burden on you, but also it allows us to streamline this process and make it much more responsive to your needs. Okay, so then let's just look at one aspect in some detail. So let's look at the where you're going to, so which orbit you're going into. Now most CubeSats, and I'm saying this is all to do with CubeSats, will go into low Earth orbit because of the nature of the launch opportunities that arise. So what we can do again is actually accelerate the process of assessment, because if we know pretty well where you're going into, so this is a representation of low Earth orbit, it's an idea of spatial density, so red means crowded regions of low Earth orbit. What we can do is, in advance of you coming to us, for a number of mission scenarios, so different orbits, we can fly your prospective mission through the population space environment and work out the risk of how many other objects you might encounter, and therefore what that translates into technical risk for us. So this gives you an idea of where some of the bigger objects are in orbit. So this is spatial density. You can ignore that. It just means the higher this goes up, the more objects there are per unit volume. And this is altitude. So you can see that there are peaks around 800 where we had ASAT tests and collisions between satellites. And there are some low density areas as well. But there are clearly some very expensive assets up there that we would be concerned about you colliding with, and therefore we would probably encourage you to go to the lower altitudes, especially with CubeSats, depending on your capability to manoeuvre and avoid collisions. So we can then go one step further. So we can, as I said, take these generic missions and work out the collision probability with the background population, which is a representation of our liability exposure to other satellites. And you can get some idea that, for instance, here at the peak population densities, also if you go to higher inclinations, you're going to get a higher collision risk. So we can do all this in advance, and so we can have already prepared, before you even knock on the door or pick up the phone to us, we know in those regions where CubeSats are going to go, where the areas are we want to, we're comfortable with you going to, and those we want to avoid. So for instance, if you're going to come to us with a CubeSat mission proposal, and you have no propulsion on board, and you want to launch it into 800 kilometres, I can tell you now, you will not get a licence from us. And so what we're trying to do is educate people, especially new entrants to space, who don't understand some of these nuances and dependencies, and actually help them to design their missions so that they can comply with our obligations, but therefore the demands and concerns of the wider international space community. So again, where you're going is not just a question of what you might meet there, but how long you're going to be there. So CubeSats, again, if they have no propulsion on board, you can work out for a 1U CubeSat form factor how long it's going to be up there for. So even though space is pretty much a vacuum, the atmosphere does extend up into orbit up to about 1,000 kilometres, and certainly above, certainly up to about 600 kilometres, things will come back over a period of time. So you can use that natural degradation of the orbits to actually remove stuff. But once you get above a certain altitude, it tends to be that once you put it there, it stays at that altitude. And so we found that you can do calculations and show that, so this is lifetime in years. So this is 1, 10, 100, and this is the altitude of a circular, the perigee altitude of a circular orbit object in this case, but also eccentric elliptical orbits. And you can work out for a 1U CubeSat form factor, if you put it above 660, 670, there's a good chance it's going to stay there for more than 25 years. Why is 25 years important? Because that's a reflection of our obligations under those treaties, conventions, guidelines that we signed up to at the UN. So if you're going to an orbit above this threshold, you're not going to be compliant, and therefore you won't get a license. So don't waste your time even making the application. So increasingly, when people come to us, we are performing this traffic light assessment and giving them indications of whether the different aspects of their mission will be compliant or not. So a good example is where you're going to. If you have a LEO satellite, your CubeSat is going into an orbit less than 25 years natural orbital lifetime, it's going to come back in compliance with the treaties and the obligations and the guidelines. So for that aspect at least, we will likely give you a license. You could go into higher altitude orbits if you have propulsion on board, or if you have some mechanism on board which can bring you back within 25 years. So we would say, okay, it's possible we could issue a license for that aspect, but we need to see some evidence, proof of your testing concept, how you validated that, and how you can ensure the reliability of that system, so when you need it in 5 years' time, it's actually going to perform as expected, and you don't command it and nothing happens, and then it's left in an orbit which is more than 25 years, which again is against our obligations. And again, this is, as I say, you will not get a license if you come to us with this type of orbit proposal. Okay, so you may be aware that a few years ago we reduced our insurance requirement. That's because, this is for all missions, and this was because at the time we were dealing pretty much with standard missions, so geosatellites, with established payloads, established mission profiles, established platforms. And so we're able to reduce our ask for you from 100 million to 60 million. The reason we were able to do that was because we were moving from an insurance-based regime where we just had the safety net. We had a figure which said, well, this is good enough. This should allow us to cover our liability concerns should something happen in orbit. But what we've done now is we're taking a more informed, like an underwriter, a more informed assessment of the risk involved. So we are asking for more information. So that there's a trade-off. If you want to reduce insurance cover, you need for us to understand more about the system. And therefore, we need to have more information about how it's going to work and testing regimes for it. Also, we need to know more about what's going on in orbit, what's the status of the subsystems, are there safety critical elements that are beginning to fail, and therefore, do we need to supervise you and make sure that you bring it down in a certain time frame while you still have control and you don't just leave it up there. So what's happening is we've moved the risks away from you guys more to us. But I say we only do that on the basis of a more informed assessment of what we're taking. Now for CubeSats, there's another element, another extension to this. In some cases, especially some of the green-rated mission profiles that we're looking at, we believe that there's actually very limited exposure to liability on behalf of us and you as an operator. And therefore, I think we're taking a view, and this may be reflected in the Space Industry Bill, that we could reduce insurance cover and in some cases actually remove our requirement for insurance cover, where we think there's a very low probability that we'll ever need it. We're also trying, as I said, in the cases of CubeSats, because we can fly these standard missions through synthetic orbital environments prior to actually even applying for a license, we can get some estimate as to the likely risk, and therefore we don't need to do too much after the application's received, because we can do much of it ahead of time. Because you're using standard, in some cases, standard form factors for your CubeSats, you're using standard deployment mechanisms, procedures from well-established platforms. Well, again, we can ask for less information because if we know what you're using and we're comfortable with that, that may well be enough. And again, if we're putting more and more burden to some extent on the operators to tell us, report to us what's going on the platform level and subsystem level. Again, rather than us spend too much time doing this ourselves, that you tell us, but there's reliance obviously on you to tell us but if there is a problem, so we can help you with that. So this is the approach that we're starting to employ for CubeSats. And as I said, in the case of the traffic light system, and there are people, we've certainly done over 20 traffic light assessments in the last year, and people have used that to then go away and, if necessary, modify their missions so they can come back to us with a compliant solution. Okay, so last two slides. So in the future, if you were to come to, I'm not saying this is the solution to all your problems or to all our problems, but if you're asking me which mission is likely to get green lights in all aspects, and possibly we may be able to waive the insurance requirement, then, and we're not promoting any of these particular solutions, but it may be something like this where, for instance, it's gone up to the ISS and it's going to go off a dispenser, which is great because we're not even responsible for the launch segment, so we're not too concerned how you get to the station or whatever your platform is, but that reduces some of the risk, launch risk for us. Your platform conforms to a standard, industrial standard. There are a number of them out there, but the standard is not just the design, but that's how you're going to operate it as well. So if you go to ISO, there are a number of international standards. There are there's lots of guidance there as to how you could operate these systems as well in orbit. And then again, obviously the fact that you're going from the space station, as long as you're going below it, then you're clearly going into an orbit with an orbital lifetime less than 25 years. So clearly you get green lights for all of those. And as I said, in some cases, obviously if your CubeSat is going to go up there and test nuclear weapons, then clearly you're going to get a red light for this. But if it's a standard inert CubeSat, relatively inert CubeSat, then it's highly likely that you would get a license, and possibly we could waive the insurance requirement. But so this is all very fluid. As I said, we've been piloting the traffic light system. Since we started all these discussions, and some of the people in the room have been involved in that heavily, for which thanks for the feedback on that, the Space Industry Bill has come along, and many of these regulatory aspects are now being reflected in the bill. That's the primary legislation. We had a meeting with the secondary legislation team a couple of days ago, and the bill is that big. I suspect the secondary legislation is going to be probably that big, and so many of these aspects will have to start to find their way through and be translated into secondary legislation. But that's the other aspect. There will be greater transparency of what we're asking for you. So when you come to us, you know in advance what we're going to be asking you in this process. And I think with that, that's the last one. Yeah.
At the end, nearly at the end, I will just recap what our speakers have covered. So hopefully today, you will have learned lots of things. Why we regulate, what is regulated, who you talk to and when. And I think one of the messages from both Ofcom and the Space Agency is come and talk to us early about your projects. We really want to hear about them. We really want to try and help you find a way through the regulations to make it work. We talked about frequencies, and you get a flavour of the information that's available about frequencies which you can identify. We've also run through the filing process. That, like everything in this process, was an overview, and if you want to find out more, you can look at our procedures which are published. You've learned about getting a spectrum license for an Earth station and Outer Space Act licensing. So that's just to recap what we covered at the beginning. You now know a little bit about each of those phases, what actually goes on in each of those, and I hope that has been useful. Now, if you want to find out more, because this is only scratching the surface, there are plenty of resources. I've got the Ofcom ones here, and Richard's already mentioned the Space Agency resources. First of all, if you haven't already, you can sign up for updates from our website for anything spectrum related. We have something called the Satellite Consultative Committee, which meets about twice a year, and is an overview of current satellite spectrum regulation issues. If you want to sign up for that, you can contact Debbie on that email. Our next one is actually quite soon, on November. And then, as Barrett mentioned, we have some preparatory groups for the international process for the World Radio Conference, which helps develop UK positions for those conferences. And I've got the contact details there. So Barrett mentioned Working Group 2, and also there's Working Group 3 for other satellite issues. For anything to do with satellite filing inquiries, there's a special email address, IFC inquiries. And then for anything else, and I'm sure there will be lots of other questions, I've got the contact details for our stakeholder manager, Elizabeth Quintana, who actually was responsible for setting up this event, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I would say thank you for her for doing that. But she is your main contact, or also you can contact me directly as well. So this afternoon, I think some of you already pre-booked some short discussions with us, and the details for those I think are at the back. Debbie's got a sheet with who you are meeting and where and when. But of course, please get in contact if you want to have a separate meeting with us. We're always happy to do that. So I think the next thing is lunch. Do we have lunch? Lunch is ready outside. Thank you very much.